The clock read 8:42 a.m. as Malcolm Hayes pulled into the parking lot outside the Greenville Municipal Courthouse in South Carolina. The sun was already beating down, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Malcolm exhaled, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror. He hated being late. As a federal prosecutor, Malcolm's life revolved around precision and discipline. But today, circumstances had worked against him. This wasn't supposed to be a complex morning, just a routine hearing regarding a property tax adjustment on his late grandmother's house. The city had suddenly increased the property tax without proper justification. Malcolm had spent weeks gathering documents, proving the adjustment was a mistake. The house wasn't just a building, it was his childhood, a piece of his family's history. He wouldn't let bureaucracy take it away. Dressed in a navy blue suit with a crisp white shirt, Malcolm looked every bit the seasoned attorney that he was, but even with his professional appearance, he knew that in a municipal courthouse like this, his presence alone would draw attention. His morning had already been chaotic. A last-minute emergency on a federal human trafficking case had required his immediate attention. The defense team had filed a sudden motion, and Malcolm couldn't just ignore it. By the time he wrapped up, he was barely making it to court on time. As he stepped out of his car, his phone buzzed. A message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's Office popped up. Judge Whitman has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful. Malcolm sighed. He wasn't worried. Facts were his weapon, and he came armed with evidence. He strode up the courthouse steps, feeling the weight of the morning pressing on his shoulders. The moment he stepped inside, the cool air offered no relief from the tension. The dull beige walls, the scent of old paper and cheap coffee, the shuffling of worried citizens, it all felt eerily familiar. People clutched documents, whispering anxiously about parking tickets, minor disputes, and municipal violations. This was the kind of courtroom where justice was often reduced to a numbers game. Malcolm checked his watch, 8:50 a.m., just 10 minutes to spare, barely enough time to find the right courtroom. Following the signs, he made his way down a narrow hallway, passing murmuring voices and stressed faces. Finally, he stopped in front of room 204. The brass plaque on the door read, "On Judge Charles Whitman." Adjusting his tie, Malcolm pushed the door open, stepping into a courtroom already filled with people. He found a seat in the back, flipping open his folder to review his case one last time. Then he felt it, the sharp gaze of Judge Whitman, scanning the room like a predator surveying its territory. Malcolm had no idea that before the morning was over, he wouldn't just be fighting a tax case, he would be exposing a system rotten to its core. Malcolm sat near the back of the courtroom, his fingers flipping through the neatly arranged papers in his folder. He had everything he needed: official tax records, letters of assessment, and a detailed breakdown of why the city's property tax adjustment was a mistake. Despite the mundane nature of his case, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in his chest. Judge Charles Whitman, a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, scanned the courtroom with a cold detachment. His reputation preceded him: strict, no nonsense, and known for his intolerance toward anyone he deemed disrespectful. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise." The room shuffled as everyone stood. Judge Whitman took his seat, flipping through a stack of files. "But let's begin," he said, his voice firm and disinterested. Malcolm watched carefully as cases were called. The first was a middle-aged businessman, slightly disheveled, who rushed in a few minutes late. He received no reprimand. The next was a young woman in jeans and a hoodie who slipped in even later. Again, no reaction from the judge. Malcolm made a mental note. Then, at exactly 9:15 a.m., his name rang through the room. Malcolm Hayes. He stood, his posture straight, folder in hand, and made his way toward the podium. Judge Whitman looked up, his gaze sharpening the moment Malcolm stepped forward. A flicker of something indiscernible crossed the judge's face. Surprise? Annoyance? Contempt? "You're late, Mr. Hayes," the judge said, his voice suddenly clipped and harsh. A chill passed through the room. Malcolm inclined his head slightly, his tone professional. Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was handling an urgent federal matter this morning. Judge Whitman cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court runs on order and respect. If you can't follow that, perhaps you should reevaluate your priorities. The weight of dozens of eyes settled on Malcolm. A $750 fine for tardiness. Malcolm's fingers tightened slightly around his folder, but his face remained unreadable. The unspoken reality was painfully clear. The others who arrived late weren't fined. He was. The judge's stare bore into him, waiting for a reaction. Malcolm met his gaze, holding it for just a beat longer than necessary, then nodded once, slow and deliberate. Understood, Your Honor, he said, voice even. Judge Whitman smirked slightly, like he had won. Malcolm took a step back, then silently flipped open his folder. He wasn't just here to win his case anymore. He was here to expose the system that thought it could silence him. Malcolm returned to his seat, his face unreadable, but his mind raced like a machine. He'd handled high-pressure situations before, cross-examinations, high-stakes federal cases, even death threats. But there was something uniquely insidious about what had just happened. This wasn't about a tax dispute anymore. It was about power, bias, control. The gavel slammed as Judge Whitman proceeded with the next case, acting as if nothing had happened. Malcolm studied the judge, watching his interactions like a predator observing prey. A white man, mid-40s, wearing an expensive suit, stepped up next. He had arrived even later than Malcolm. No fine, no reprimand, just a casual exchange before the judge moved on. Malcolm clenched his jaw slightly, but forced himself to remain composed. He wasn't about to react emotionally. That's what they wanted. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a blank legal pad. His pen moved quickly, noting timestamps, names, and discrepancies. The evidence was writing itself. The court clerk, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes, glanced at Malcolm from the side. Something in her expression lingered. It was subtle, but there, a flicker of unease, she knew. When the court recessed for a short break, Malcolm stood, adjusting his tie. He had no intention of walking out without answers. He stepped toward the clerk's desk. "Excuse me, Miss Thompson," he said smoothly. "I was hoping to verify something about municipal fines, specifically whether there's any discretion involved when assigning penalties for tardiness." She hesitated. Her hands froze mid-motion over her paperwork, and when she looked up, there was something in her gaze, a quiet warning. "I can't discuss court decisions, sir," she said, her voice low and careful. Malcolm smiled politely. "I understand. But I do find it interesting that others who arrived late today weren't fined. Just me." A slight pause. Miss Thompson pursed her lips, her fingers fidgeting with the corner of a folder. She wanted to say something. Finally, she whispered, "This isn't the first time." Malcolm's heartbeat ticked up slightly. "Excuse me?" She inhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I can't talk about it." Her eyes flicked toward the hallway doors, where a bailiff stood, watching them closely. Malcolm followed her gaze, his legal instincts going into overdrive. Something was off, and he was going to find out exactly what it was. Malcolm didn't press Miss Thompson further. He could tell she was already walking a tightrope, caught between fear and conscience. But her hesitation spoke volumes. There was more to this, a lot more. He turned away from the clerk's desk and casually walked toward the exit, but his mind was already 10 steps ahead. If Judge Whitman had a pattern of unfair rulings, Malcolm had just stumbled into a gold mine of corruption, but he needed more proof. As he stepped into the hallway, his phone buzzed. "A no number?" Malcolm hesitated before answering. "Roberts." A hushed voice came through the line, female, nervous. "You need to be careful," she whispered. Malcolm's grip on his phone tightened. "Who is this?" A pause. "Someone who's seen this happen before." Before he could press further, the call cut off. Malcolm stood still for a moment, processing. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't just him. This was bigger than one find. He exhaled slowly. Time to get to work. By the time Malcolm returned to his office, his assistant, Eva Carter, was already waiting for him. "You look pissed," she said, arms crossed. Malcolm set his briefcase down and exhaled. "I need you to pull everything we have on Judge Whitman." Eva's brow furrowed. "Why? What happened?" Malcolm didn't sit. He paced. "I just left his courtroom, got slapped with a $750 fine for being 3 minutes late. Meanwhile, 2 white defendants walked in even later. Nothing." Eva's jaw tightened. "That's not just bias. That's targeted." "Exactly." Malcolm ran a hand over his face. "And it gets worse. The court clerk knows something, but she won't talk. And someone just called me anonymously, warning me to be careful." Eva's eyes sharpened. "That means whatever this is, it's worth hiding." Malcolm nodded. "So we started digging. I want patterns, rulings, fines, dismissals, anything that shows disparity." Eva didn't hesitate. "I'm on it." As she grabbed her laptop and got to work, Malcolm leaned against his desk, arms crossed. He had handled corruption cases before, but this was personal, and he wasn't about to let it slide. Eva worked fast. Within an hour, she had pulled years' worth of court records. Malcolm stood over her shoulder, scanning the data as she highlighted key findings. "Hey, look at this," she said, pointing at a list of cases. "Over the last 5 years, Judge Whitman has issued higher fines for late appearances to black defendants than to white defendants, and it's not even close. We're talking a 300% disparity." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "That's not negligence. That's deliberate." Eva nodded. "And it gets worse. When it comes to case dismissals, white defendants have a 40% higher chance of getting their cases dropped than black defendants." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "This isn't just about me. This is a systemic issue." Eva scrolled further, stopping at a familiar name. "And get this. Judge Whitman has a record of working closely with certain law firms, specifically those representing wealthy white clients with connections to city officials." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "That explains a lot. And it also means he's protecting people." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Miss Thompson, the court clerk. She stepped inside quickly, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure she wasn't being followed. "You are right," she said in a hushed tone. "I found something." Malcolm and Eva exchanged a glance. "Close the door," Malcolm said. Miss Thompson hesitated for only a moment before she did. Then, from her coat pocket, she pulled out a small notebook, worn from years of use. "I've been keeping records," she whispered. "Every time something didn't sit right in that courtroom, I wrote it down." Malcolm leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "How far back does this go?" Miss Thompson swallowed hard. 15 years. Eva let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of corruption." Malcolm took the notebook from her, flipping through the pages. His eyes widened as he read. "Judge Whitman personally intervened in cases where certain names came up," Malcolm muttered. "He manipulated sentencing, threw out legitimate charges, and covered for people with political influence." Ms. Thompson nodded. "And anyone who questioned him," she hesitated, "they didn't last long." Malcolm met her eyes. People got fired. Fired, demoted, transferred. The ones who spoke up were either pushed out or just disappeared from the system. Malcolm felt a cold rage settle in his chest. This wasn't just bias. This was corruption. And now they had proof. Malcolm gripped the notebook tightly, his pulse steady but his mind racing. 15 years of corruption, cover-ups, and blatant abuse of power, all documented by a woman who had been too afraid to speak out. Until now. Eva straightened up, glancing toward the door. "If Whitman catches wind of this, he'll start covering his tracks. We need to move fast." Miss Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "You don't understand," she whispered. Whitman isn't just another judge. He's protected. There are people in this city, powerful people, who won't let him go down without a fight. Malcolm locked eyes with her. Then we hit fast, and we hit hard. He flipped through the pages again, stopping at a specific date. A case name stood out, one he recognized. "Hear and call," Malcolm murmured. "I prosecuted this case 2 years ago." Eva leaned in. "What happened?" Malcolm's jaw clenched. Cole was charged with embezzlement. The evidence was rock solid, but the judge, Whitman, suddenly dismissed the case. No explanation, just gone. Ida frowned. "That doesn't make sense." Miss Thompson exhaled sharply. "Because it was never about evidence." She tapped a line in her notes. Cole donated nearly $500,000 to a private fund the week before the dismissal. Malcolm's blood ran cold. So Whitman was getting paid off to throw cases. Miss Thompson nodded. And Cole wasn't the only one. She flipped to another page, showing a list of names. Some Malcolm recognized. Businessmen, city officials, even a former police commissioner. Eva snapped a photo of the page. "This is a bombshell." Malcolm inhaled deeply, controlling his anger. "Then let's detonate it." A sudden buzz from his phone made him freeze. A message from an unknown number. "You need to stop now before you regret it." Eva peered over his shoulder. "Anonymous?" Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. "They know." Miss Thompson pales. "We're in danger." Malcolm's voice was calm but firm. "Not us. They are. Because now we're going to make sure the whole world knows what they've done." Malcolm's eyes flicked between the phone screen and Miss Thompson's terrified expression. The weight of the message settled like cold iron in his chest. Eva took a deep breath, rolling her shoulders back. "Okay, this changes things. They're watching us, which means they're scared." Malcolm nodded. "Scared people make mistakes." He turned to Miss Thompson. "Do you have copies of these records? Somewhere safe?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I never thought I'd need to." Then the police said, "We're in jail, Porter. Por each other." Eva cursed under her breath. "Then we need to get these digitized now." Malcolm grabbed his phone. "I'll call a secure contact at the DOJ. We need to move fast before they try to bury this." Just as he started dialing, the courthouse intercom crackled to life. "All personnel, please remain where you are. A security sweep is in progress." Malcolm's stomach dropped. They were moving already. His eyes snapped to the door. "We have to go now." Miss Thompson clutched her notes to her chest. "Go where?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. Somewhere safe. He grabbed the files and shoved them into his briefcase. "Ava, is there a back exit?" She nodded. "Dur's corridor. Follow me." They moved quickly, keeping their heads down as the murmur of voices outside grew louder. Officers were patrolling, scanning the hallways. Malcolm tightened his grip on the briefcase. If they got caught now, it wouldn't just be a threat. It would be over. Eva led them through a dimly lit hallway, past old filing cabinets and forgotten case records. The air was thick with dust, the scent of aged paper lingering. At the end of the corridor was a metal door with a rusted push bar. Eva pressed against it. Locked. Miss Thompson's breath hitched. Now what? Malcolm pulled a thin leather wallet from his pocket, flipping it open. Inside, nestled among his IDs, was a small metal lockpick. Eva raised her brow. "Seriously?" He didn't answer, just knelt and got to work. The seconds stretched painfully long. Voices. Footsteps. Getting closer. "Malcolm," Eva whispered urgently. Click, the lock gave way. He pushed the door open just as shadows rounded the corner behind them. "Go," Malcolm urged. They slipped into the alley behind the courthouse just as a group of officers stormed the hallway they had been in seconds before. Miss Thompson let out a shaky breath. That was too close. Malcolm's jaw was set. It won't be the last time. He looked toward the city skyline, determination burning in his eyes. They wanted a fight, he muttered. Now they've got one. The alley behind the courthouse was damp, the scent of rain still clinging to the air. Malcolm took a slow breath, steadying his pulse. They had barely escaped, but the real danger was just beginning. Eva glanced back at Miss Thompson, who was clutching the files like they were her lifeline. "We need to keep moving," she whispered. "Whitman's men won't take long to figure out where we went." Malcolm nodded. "There's a parking garage 2 blocks down. We can disappear there." They kept to the shadows, moving quickly but carefully. Sirens blared in the distance, and the occasional sweep of headlights forced them to duck behind dumpsters and parked cars. Every second counted. As they neared the garage, Malcolm pulled out his phone. He needed a secure way to transfer the files before Whitman's people caught up. Eva noticed. "What's the plan?" "Getting this to someone who can expose it before Whitman destroys everything," Malcolm replied. "We need an off-site backup." Miss Thompson hesitated. "There's a retired judge, Harold Graves. He always suspected Whitman was corrupt, but never had proof. If we get this to him, he can push it through official channels." Malcolm's eyes flicked to Eva. "We need a ride, fast." Eva pulled out her own phone, fingers flying across the screen. "Give me 30 seconds. They reached the parking garage and slipped inside just as a patrol car cruised past the entrance. Malcolm's jaw tightened. "They're sweeping the area," he muttered. Eva smirked. "Good thing we won't be here long." A black SUV pulled up near the back of the garage. Its driver, a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes, rolled down the window. "You owe me for this one," he said to Eva. "Put it on my tab," she shot back. Miss Thompson climbed into the back seat, still clutching the documents. Malcolm took one last glance at the street outside. His instincts were screaming. They weren't safe yet. Then tires screeched. 2 unmarked cars whipped around the corner, headlights cutting through the dim garage. "They found us," Miss Thompson gasped. Malcolm didn't hesitate. "Go, now." Eva's contact floored the gas pedal, the SUV roaring to life as it sped toward the exit ramp. Behind them, the unmarked cars followed, their tires squealing against the pavement. "Hold on," Eva muttered. The chase was on. The SUV shot forward, weaving through the parking garage as the 2 unmarked cars closed in behind them. Malcolm gripped the door handle as Eva's contact swerved sharply to avoid a concrete pillar. The tires screeched, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. "You're not backing off." Miss Thompson clutched the documents to her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. "They won't," Malcolm said grimly. "Not until they have these files. Or us." Eva twisted in her seat, glancing at the pursuing vehicles. "We need to get off the main road before they box us in." "Hold tight," the driver muttered. He yanked the wheel hard, the SUV fishtailing as it barreled toward the exit ramp. The moment they hit open air, he slammed the gas pedal, sending the vehicle rocketing into the busy morning traffic. The unmarked cars followed, their engines roaring as they swerved between lanes, forcing other cars to honk and swerve out of the way. Malcolm's mind raced. They couldn't keep running like this. Whitman's men were relentless, and even if they lost them temporarily, they'd be found again. They needed to disappear for good. "Eva, any ideas?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos. She was already typing on her phone. "I know a place, but we have to lose them first." The driver gritted his teeth. "There's a construction site up ahead. If we time it right, we can shake them." Eva met Malcolm's gaze. "You good with some risk?" Malcolm exhaled. "At this point, it's the only option we've got." The driver made a sharp right, speeding toward a half-built high-rise. Steel beams jutted into the sky, cranes looming overhead like silent sentinels. Workers scattered as the SUV barreled through an open gate. The unmarked cars hesitated for half a second, Just enough. Enough, Eva yelled. The driver yanked the emergency brake, spinning the SUV into a sharp turn. Dust and gravel kicked up in thick clouds, temporarily blinding their pursuers. Malcolm grabbed Miss Thompson's arm. Out! Now! They threw open the doors, darting into the chaos of the construction site, just as the dust began to settle. Eva led them toward a narrow service tunnel. This leads to the next block over. If we're fast, we can vanish before they realize we're gone. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He pushed Miss Thompson ahead, his own pulse pounding. Behind them, the sound of car doors slamming and angry shouting echoed through the site. They had seconds before Whitman's men caught up. Eva glanced back. We need to move faster. Malcolm tightened his grip on the files. Let's go. They disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, leaving their pursuers behind. For now, the tunnel was damp, the air thick with dust and the scent of old concrete. Malcolm, Eva, and Miss Thompson moved swiftly, their footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. Behind them, the muffled sounds of shouting and hurried footsteps grew louder. Whitman's men were closing in. We're running out of time, Eva whispered, glancing over her shoulder. They're too close. Malcolm's mind raced. They had made it this far, but there was no clear exit yet. If Whitman's people caught them now, it wouldn't just be a setback, it would be the end. Up ahead, the tunnel forked into two paths. One led into darkness, the other sloped slightly upward, revealing a faint outline of a service door at the end. Malcolm pointed. Eva sprinted ahead, testing the door handle. It didn't budge. Lock. Malcolm pulled out his lockpick set again, but before he could kneel, Eva grabbed his arm. No time. She pulled a small tool from her boot, a compact crowbar. With a sharp grunt, she jammed it into the door frame and wrenched it sideways. The metal groaned, resisting for only a moment before the latch gave way. They spilled into a dimly lit stairwell. Up or down? Miss Thompson asked, her voice shaking. Malcolm hesitated for half a second before making the call. Up. They'll expect us to go down. They bolted up the stairs, taking 2 steps at a time. The air grew warmer, fresher, a good sign. But behind them, the distant slam of a door told them everything they needed to know. Their pursuers weren't far behind. Eva reached the top first, slamming into another door. She twisted the handle. Unlocked. What's the key? She asked. I heard the gun shot. The door slammed against bow, it twisted. They stumbled into daylight. The rooftop was expansive, a wide open platform with a direct view of the city skyline. The morning sun cast sharp shadows against the metal vents and air conditioning units scattered across the roof. Malcolm turned, his heart still pounding. We're exposed up here? Eva scanned the perimeter. We just need to buy time until our contact arrives. Miss Thompson backed away from the stairwell door. And if they reach us first? Malcolm's jaw clenched. Then we make sure they regret it. The door behind them burst open. 4 men stormed onto the rooftop, their weapons drawn. Whitman wasn't taking chances anymore. Malcolm stepped in front of Miss Thompson, shielding her instinctively. Eva's stance shifted, ready to fight, but knowing the odds weren't in their favor. The lead man, dressed in a gray suit and a smirk, raised his gun. You've made this difficult, Hayes. But this is over. Malcolm stared him down, his mind working rapidly. He still had the files, he still had leverage, and he wasn't about to let Whitman win. Not today. The rooftop standoff stretched into a tense silence. Malcolm's mind was racing, analyzing every possible move. He wasn't armed, but that didn't mean he was defenseless. Eva, standing beside him, was already assessing the situation. 4 men, all armed. They had the numbers, the weapons, and the high ground. But Malcolm knew something they didn't. Desperation had a way of making people dangerous. The man in the gray suit, clearly in charge, took a step forward. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. His tone was eerily calm. Hand over the documents, and we walk away. No one gets hurt. Malcolm exhaled slowly. You mean besides the countless people already hurt because of Whitman's corruption? The man chuckled, shaking his head. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about one bad judge. This is about the system. You really think exposing a few files is going to change anything? Eva took a half step forward. You seem pretty eager to stop us. I guess that means these files matter more than you're letting on. The smirk on the man's face faltered for a brief second before he straightened his shoulders. Enough talk. Last chance. Hand them over, or we end this right now. Malcolm glanced at Miss Thompson, who clutched the files tightly against her chest. If they gave them up, everything they had fought for would disappear. If they refused, the guns pointed at them made it clear what would happen next. But Malcolm wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. He took a deep breath, steadied his stance, and stared straight into the eyes of the man leading the ambush. No. The response hung in the air like a gunshot. The man sighed, almost as if he was disappointed. Then, in a flash, he raised his hand. A single gunshot rang out, but it didn't come from their attackers. One of Whitman's men staggered, his weapon clattering to the ground. The other spun in shock, searching for the source of the shot. Then a voice rang out from across the rooftop. Federal agents, drop your weapons. Malcolm turned just in time to see figures emerging onto the rooftop. FBI agents, tactical gear gleaming under the morning sun. The lead agent, a tall black man with a bulletproof vest that read DOJ, stepped forward, gun still trained on the attackers. Malcolm Hayes, he called, nodding toward Malcolm. We've been monitoring the courthouse security feeds. Figured you might need a little backup. The tide had turned. The men who had been so confident seconds ago were now frozen, their hands hovering over their weapons, unsure whether to fight or surrender. Whitman had sent his people to silence Malcolm. Instead, he had just sealed his own fate. Malcolm exhaled, relief washing over him. But this wasn't over yet. He turned toward the lead agent. We need to take this to Whitman right now. The agent nodded. Already in motion. Malcolm looked back at the men who had cornered them. Their arrogance had faded, replaced with uncertainty. You were right, Malcolm said to them, voice calm but firm. This isn't about one bad judge. It's about the system. He took a step closer, watching as they stiffened. And today, that system starts fighting back. The rooftop was now swarming with federal agents, securing the scene. Malcolm turned toward Eva and Miss Thompson, nodding slightly. It was time to end this. One final move left to make. And Whitman was about to face the reckoning he never saw coming. The doors of the Greenville courthouse burst open as Malcolm, Eva, and Miss Thompson stepped inside, flanked by FBI agents. The tension was suffocating. Every step they took echoed through the marble halls, drawing the eyes of clerks, attorneys, and onlookers who sensed something monumental was about to unfold. At the far end of the hall, Judge Charles Whitman stood, frozen, his face pale as he watched the group approach. He had spent years commanding respect in this very courthouse, but today his authority was crumbling beneath the weight of the truth. Malcolm didn't stop. He walked straight up to Whitman, holding the evidence files in his hands. The moment had finally arrived. Judge Whitman, Malcolm said, his voice steady, these documents prove beyond a doubt that you've engaged in systemic discrimination, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. He lifted the folder slightly. You covered up cases, buried complaints, and ensured your allies stayed protected while others suffered. Whitman's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He glanced around, but there was nowhere to run. The courthouse, once his stronghold, had become his prison. You don't have the authority to. Actually, I do. Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out a formal indictment, stamped with the seal of the Department of Justice. This is an official federal order. As of this moment, you are being removed from the bench pending a full investigation. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Some whispered in shock. Others exchanged knowing glances. The courtroom staff, many of whom had endured Whitman's unchecked power, held their breath, waiting for what came next. Whitman's face twisted into fury. This is absurd. You think some reports and accusations can bring me down? He took a step forward, arms crossed. No, The hard evidence, FBI surveillance, and testimony from your own staff? Yeah, that'll do it. At that moment, 2 federal agents stepped up beside Whitman. Judge Whitman, one of them announced, "You are under federal investigation. You'll need to come with us." The judge's face turned beet red. "I'll have you all disbarred. You hear me? This is a damn witch hunt." Malcolm stayed calm. "No, this is accountability, something you've avoided your entire career, but today that ends." The moment Whitman was escorted away, the dam broke. People murmured, some in shock, others in relief. It was over. The system had finally caught up with the man who thought he was untouchable. Miss Thompson exhaled shakily, her hands still gripping the notes she had risked everything to bring forward. "I never thought I'd see the day." Malcolm turned to her, his expression softer now. "You made this happen. You stood up when no one else would." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "So did you." Eva smirked. "You both did. But let's not celebrate just yet. We have a whole system to fix." Malcolm nodded. This was just the beginning. 6 months later, the changes were undeniable. A new judge, one with a reputation for fairness, now presided over the municipal court. An independent oversight committee had been formed to monitor judicial decisions, ensuring transparency and accountability. Malcolm stood at the back of the courthouse, watching as a group of young attorneys and law students gathered for a seminar on judicial ethics. He had been invited to speak, to share his experience, to ensure that what happened with Whitman would never happen again. Eva walked up beside him, sipping her coffee. "Still feels surreal, doesn't it?" He nodded. "It does. But it also feels right." Mr. Thompson, now promoted to a higher administrative role, stepped up, a folder in her hands. "I thought you might want to see this." Malcolm took it, flipping it open. Inside was a report showing the drastic drop in unfair fines and biased rulings since Whitman's removal. It wasn't just numbers. It was proof that change was possible. He exhaled. We did it." Eva grinned. "No, Malcolm, this is just the beginning." As Malcolm looked around at the courthouse, at the people now empowered, the systems being rebuilt, and the justice being restored, he realized she was right. The fight wasn't over. But today, they had won.